The Night of Shadows. Ellie's mind raced as the car veered farther off the highway, the headlights piercing through the thick wall of trees. The man behind the wheel, his easy smile now a distant memory, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set. The air inside the car grew suffocating, filled with an electric tension that prickled Ellie's skin. She glanced at the dashboard, noting the fuel gauge was nearly full. Wherever he was taking her, it wasn't close. Her heart pounded as she searched for a way out. The door handle wouldn't budge, and the locks were clearly engaged. Ellie's hands trembled as she fumbled for anything sharp or heavy in her bag. A lens, a screwdriver from her gear kit, anything. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of her tripod, but before she could pull it free, the man's voice cut through the silence. "You look nervous," he said, his tone now dripping with malice. "Relax. This will be over before you know it." Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Please," she stammered, forcing her voice to stay steady. "If you let me go, I won't say anything. I'll just walk away. I swear." The man chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Oh, sweetheart, you're not going anywhere." The car jolted to a stop in a clearing so remote that even the moonlight seemed reluctant to intrude. The engine sputtered into silence, and the only sounds were the cicadas and Ellie's shallow breathing. The driver turned to her, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife, the blade catching the faint glimmer of light. "Out!" he barked, motioning with the knife. Ellie's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She tried to plead again, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she shook her head, inching toward the opposite door, desperate to create distance. The man growled in frustration, yanking her arm so hard that she tumbled out of the car and onto the dirt. Pain shot through her knees and palms as she landed, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. The man loomed over her, his shadow engulfing her trembling form. Before he could make his next move, a rustling sound came from the trees. Both Ellie and her captor froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "Stay here," he hissed, brandishing the knife as he stalked toward the trees. Ellie's pulse raced. This was her chance. She scrambled to her feet, adrenaline propelling her forward as she bolted toward the car. The keys were still in the ignition. If she could just reach the driver's seat, she might have a shot at escape. Her hands fumbled with the door handle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, a hand clamped around her ankle, yanking her backward. She hit the ground hard, the air forced from her lungs. The man towered over her, his face contorted with rage. "You really shouldn't have done that," he snarled, raising the knife. Ellie thrashed wildly, kicking at his legs and clawing at the dirt beneath her. Her fingertips grazed a small, jagged rock, and without thinking, she snatched it up and swung it at his face. The impact startled him enough to loosen his grip, and Ellie didn't waste a second. She scrambled to her feet and darted into the woods. The forest was a maze of darkness, the towering trees and thick underbrush conspiring to trip her at every turn. She ran blindly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she could hear the man crashing through the foliage, cursing loudly. Ellie's legs burned, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She stumbled over a root and fell hard, her hands scraping against the rough bark of a fallen tree. Her body screamed at her to stop, to rest, but she forced herself to get up. Giving up wasn't an option. The forest began to thin, and through the trees, she glimpsed the faint outline of a cabin. A flicker of hope ignited within her as she changed direction, sprinting toward the structure. Her chest ached with every breath, but the thought of sanctuary pushed her forward. She reached the cabin, banging on the door with what little strength she had left. "Help," she cried, her voice hoarse. "Please, someone help me." There was no answer. Ellie's heart sank as she realized the cabin was abandoned, its windows boarded up, and its door padlocked. Her hope crumbled, replaced by a crushing sense of despair. Behind her, the man's voice rang out, closer than she'd anticipated. "You can't hide from me, sweetheart. I'll find you." Ellie's mind raced. She needed to stay hidden, but the open clearing offered little cover. She spotted a pile of firewood stacked against the cabin and ducked behind it, pressing herself against the rough logs. Her chest heaved as she tried to silence her breathing, her ears straining for any sound. The man entered the clearing, his silhouette stark against the moonlight. He held the knife in one hand, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're only making this harder on yourself," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Come out now, and I might go easy on you." Ellie clutched her knees to her chest, willing herself to disappear. She could hear his footsteps crunching against the gravel, drawing closer. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. The man paused, his head tilting as he surveyed the area. "I can smell your fear," he sneered. "It's delicious." Ellie's fingers brushed against a loose log in the pile, its weight reassuring in her hands. She tightened her grip, her body coiled like a spring. If he found her, she would fight. She would not go down without a struggle. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her hiding spot. Ellie held her breath, every muscle in her body taut. The man bent down, his face just inches away from the edge of the pile. And then, in a split second, Ellie swung the log with all her might into the abyss. The log connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening crunch. He stumbled back, clutching his temple, his knife falling to the ground. Ellie didn't wait to see if he'd recover. She bolted into the forest, her feet pounding against the earth as branches whipped against her face and arms. Her chest burned with every breath, and her legs felt like lead, but she couldn't stop. The memory of his predatory grin and the cold gleam of the knife spurred her forward. She could still hear his groans behind her, followed by the rustle of leaves as he gave chase once more. The forest felt endless, a labyrinth of shadows and jagged undergrowth. Ellie's bare arms and legs were scraped raw, but she pressed on, her senses heightened by fear. Her eyes darted through the darkness, searching for a place to hide or escape. Her heart sank as she realized the terrain was working against her. The dense trees offered no clear path, and the uneven ground threatened to trip her with every step. Behind her, the man's voice rang out, his tone dripping with venom. "You're just making this harder for yourself. There's nowhere to run, sweetheart." Ellie didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Her mind raced with desperate plans, each one discarded as quickly as it formed. Her only chance was to outlast him, to keep moving until he tired or she found help. But help felt impossibly far away. She hadn't seen another car, another person, another sign of civilization since her drive began. The thought was almost enough to break her, but she shook it off. If she stopped now, she knew she wouldn't survive. The forest thinned slightly, and Ellie spotted a faint glow through the trees. Hope surged through her chest. Was it a cabin? A campfire? Whatever it was, it could mean salvation. She veered toward the light, her breaths ragged and uneven. As she drew closer, the glow revealed itself to be the distant headlights of a truck parked on a dirt road. Ellie's heart leaped. A way out. Safety. She sprinted toward it, ignoring the stabbing pain in her side and the throbbing ache in her legs. Her relief was short-lived. The man was still behind her, closer than she'd realized. His footsteps grew louder, and his harsh breathing echoed through the trees. Ellie pushed herself harder, her lungs screaming for air as she reached the edge of the forest. The truck was old and rusted, its headlights cutting through the dark like a beacon. Ellie stumbled toward it, waving her arms frantically. "Help! Please!" she screamed, her voice cracking. The driver, a burly man in his 50s, stepped out, his face etched with concern. "What's going on?" he called out, moving toward her. Ellie collapsed at his feet, her hands clutching his pant leg. "He's coming," she gasped, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "He's trying to kill me." The man's eyes darted toward the tree line as the sound of rustling leaves grew louder. He swore under his breath and reached into the truck, pulling out a shotgun. "Stay behind me," he ordered. Ellie crawled to the other side of the truck, her body trembling as she clung to the wheel. The driver aimed the shotgun at the tree line, his posture tense. The attacker emerged, his face twisted in a mix of fury and desperation. His hands were empty. He must have dropped the knife somewhere in the chase, but his intent was clear. "This doesn't concern you," he growled, his eyes locked on the driver. "Step aside." "Not a chance," the driver shot back. "Turn around and get the hell out of here, or you won't be walking away." The attacker hesitated, his gaze flicking between the shotgun and Ellie's terrified form. For a moment, it seemed like he might retreat. Then, with a snarl, he lunged forward. The blast of the shotgun shattered the night, echoing through the forest like a thunderclap. Ellie covered her ears, her heart pounding as she peeked out from behind the truck. The attacker lay sprawled on the ground, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers, but he was still alive. The driver kept the shotgun trained on him, his voice cold. "Don't move." Ellie crawled out from her hiding spot, her legs shaky. She looked at the attacker, the man who had chased her through the night, who had tried to take everything from her, and felt a surge of defiance. She was still here. She was still alive. "Call the police," the driver said, his eyes never leaving the attacker. "And make it quick." Ellie nodded, fumbling for the truck's radio. Her hands trembled as she relayed their location, her voice barely above a whisper. The operator assured her help was on the way. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. The driver stood guard over the attacker, his expression grim. Ellie leaned against the truck, her body sagging with exhaustion. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. When the sound of sirens finally broke through the stillness, Ellie let out a shaky breath. Blue and red lights flickered through the trees, and officers emerged from their vehicles, guns drawn. They quickly subdued the attacker, handcuffing him and reading him his rights. Ellie watched as he was dragged toward the patrol car, his head hung low. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt a flicker of safety. It was over. Or so she thought. A fight for life. The crackle of police radios filled the clearing as the officers secured the attacker in the back of a patrol car. Ellie sat slumped against the truck, her arms wrapped around her knees as shock began to set in. Every muscle in her body ached, and the events of the night replayed in her mind like a broken record. One of the officers approached her, his features softening as he crouched down. "Miss, are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. Ellie blinked at him, struggling to find her voice. I don't know," she admitted, her throat dry and raw from screaming. He was going to kill me." The officer nodded, his expression grave. "You're safe now. We'll take you to the station to file a report, and we'll get you medical attention." The driver of the truck, who had introduced himself as Earl, hovered nearby. "She's been through hell," he said gruffly. "I'll drive her to the hospital if you need me to." "Thank you, sir," the officer replied, "but we'll take it from here." Earl gave Ellie a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You're a tough one, kid. You hang in there." Ellie managed a weak smile, grateful for his kindness. As the officers helped her into their cruiser, she caught a glimpse of the attacker through the window of the other car. His face was pale, and his shoulder was bandaged hastily, but his eyes still burned with malice. He glared at her, his lips curling into a sneer that sent a shiver down her spine. "Don't look at him," the officer said gently, blocking her view. "He can't hurt you anymore." The ride to the station felt surreal. Ellie recounted the events of the night to the officers, her voice shaky but determined. She described every detail she could remember, the way the man had smiled when he picked her up, the fear that gripped her when the car turned off the main road, the chase through the forest. "He kept calling me sweetheart, like this was all some kind of game," she said, her hands trembling. "He didn't care if I lived or died." The officer driving glanced at her in the rearview mirror, "We'll make sure he pays for what he's done," he assured her. "You did everything right. You survived." Ellie wasn't sure if she believed him. The weight of the night pressed down on her, and she felt like a shell of herself. Survival hadn't felt like a victory. It had been a desperate, instinctual fight for existence. At the station, Ellie was met by Detective Sarah Vaughn, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a steady demeanor. She led Ellie into a quiet room where a paramedic was waiting to check her injuries. "You're incredibly lucky," the paramedic said as he cleaned the cuts on her hands and face. "You must have some serious fight in you." Ellie didn't respond. She couldn't shake the image of the attacker's sneer, the way he'd looked at her as though she was nothing more than prey. Once the paramedic finished, Detective Vaughn sat down across from Ellie. "I know this is difficult, but I need you to walk me through everything that happened," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "The more details you can give me, the stronger our case will be." Ellie nodded, taking a deep breath. She began at the moment her car broke down, recounting every agonizing detail with painstaking precision. Detective Vaughn took notes, her pen scratching against the paper as Ellie spoke. When she finished, Vaughn leaned back in her chair. "You did everything you could, Ellie," she said. "Most people wouldn't have made it out of that situation alive." Ellie swallowed hard. Has he done this before? Vaughn's expression darkened. "We're looking into it, but I wouldn't be surprised. Men like him rarely start with something like this. There's usually a pattern." The thought made Ellie's stomach churn. How many other women had suffered at his hands? How many hadn't survived? The hours dragged on as Ellie gave her statement, submitted to forensic swabs for evidence, and answered endless questions. By the time she was finally allowed to leave, the sun was rising, casting a pale golden light over the city. Detective Vaughn offered to arrange a ride home, but Ellie shook her head. "I can't go back there," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet." Instead, she found herself at a small motel on the edge of town, its neon vacancy sign flickering in the early morning light. The clerk at the front desk barely glanced at her as she paid for a room, handing over cash with trembling hands. Inside, the room was small and musty, but it felt like a haven compared to the night she'd endured. Ellie locked the door behind her, double-checked it, and then shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. Only then did she collapse onto the bed, her body shaking with silent sobs. Ellie's sleep was restless, filled with fragmented nightmares of chasing footsteps and sinister grins. She woke with a start, her heart racing, as the events of the night came crashing back. For a moment, she debated calling someone. Her sister, her best friend. But the thought of explaining everything felt too overwhelming. Instead, she sat in the motel's tiny bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot, and her hair tangled. The bruises on her arms were starting to darken, a stark reminder of the violence she'd endured. She didn't feel lucky. She didn't feel strong. She felt like she was barely holding herself together. But then she thought about the look in the attacker's eyes when he was dragged into the patrol car. She thought about the way she'd fought, the way she'd refused to give up, and she realized that, despite everything, she had survived. For now, that would have to be enough. The hunter and the prey. Ellie spent the next few days at the motel, unable to return to her apartment or even face the world outside. The police had assured her they would keep her informed about the case, but the silence was deafening. Every knock on the door made her heart race. Every passing shadow outside the window sent chills down her spine. The attacker might have been in custody, but the terror he'd instilled in her lingered like a storm cloud. By the third day, Detective Vaughn called. "Ellie," the detective began, her voice calm but edged with urgency. "We've run the attacker's prints and identified him. His name is Marcus Velt, and he has a criminal record that stretches back nearly 2 decades. Ellie's stomach churned at the name. She didn't want to know anything about him, yet the details tumbled out of Vaughn's mouth like stones. Multiple assaults, a history of stalking, and at least 2 missing women connected to him. He's been in and out of the system, but he's always slipped through on technicalities or lack of evidence. Vaughn sighed. This time, though, we have a solid case. Your testimony and the evidence we've collected will put him away for good. Ellie tightened her grip on the phone, her knuckles white. Why wasn't he stopped before? Because predators like him know how to play the system, Vaughn replied. But he made a mistake with you. He underestimated you. Ellie wasn't so sure. She felt like she'd barely escaped with her life, and the thought of facing Marcus in court made her skin crawl. Still, Vaughn's words planted a small seed of determination in her chest. She had survived, and now she had a chance to make sure he never hurt anyone else again. The weeks leading up to the trial were a blur of interviews, therapy sessions, and restless nights. Ellie's world shrank to the confines of her motel room and the occasional visit to the police station. Her family offered to come and stay with her, but she declined. She didn't want anyone else to see her like this. Fragile, haunted, broken. But the more she learned about Marcus, the more her fear began to harden into anger. Detective Vaughn shared files on the other women he had targeted, women who hadn't been as lucky as Ellie. There were photos of smiling faces, descriptions of lives cut short or forever altered. One woman had disappeared after a similar encounter. Her body was never found. Another had been found alive, but left paralyzed from the injuries Marcus had inflicted. Ellie stared at their faces, their stories pressing against her chest like a heavy weight. She couldn't bring them back, but she could fight for them. She could fight for herself. The trial began on a crisp autumn morning. Ellie arrived at the courthouse flanked by Detective Vaughn and a victim's advocate. Her palms were clammy, and her heart felt like it might burst out of her chest, but she kept her head high as she walked through the throng of reporters outside. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat at the defense table, his face devoid of emotion. He glanced at Ellie as she entered, and for a brief moment, his lips curled into a smirk. It sent a shiver down her spine, but she refused to look away. She would not let him see her fear. The prosecution laid out a damning case against Marcus, presenting evidence from the night of Ellie's attack and connecting him to the other crimes in his past. Forensic experts detailed the DNA evidence collected from Ellie's clothing and the scene, while the paramedic who treated her injuries testified about the severity of her wounds. Then it was Ellie's turn to take the stand. She sat in the witness box, her hands trembling slightly as she swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor guided her through her testimony, asking her to recount the events of that night in detail. Ellie's voice wavered at first, but as she spoke, she found strength in her words. She described how Marcus had lured her into his car, how he had chased her through the woods, how she had fought back with everything she had. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, he tried to undermine her story, suggesting that she had exaggerated or misremembered certain details. Ellie held her ground, refusing to let him twist her words. She stared straight at Marcus as she answered, her voice steady and clear. "I fought for my life," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And I survived." He didn't expect that. The trial lasted for weeks, but the verdict came swiftly. The jury found Marcus guilty on multiple charges, including attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. As the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole, Ellie felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't complete closure. Nothing could erase what had happened, but it was a step toward reclaiming her life. As Marcus was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he cast one last glance at Ellie. But this time, she didn't look away. She met his gaze head-on, her eyes burning with defiance. In the weeks that followed, Ellie began to rebuild. She moved to a new apartment in a different part of town, started therapy to process her trauma, and began volunteering with an organization that supported survivors of violence. Her scars, both physical and emotional, were still fresh, but they no longer defined her. One day, she received a package in the mail. Inside was a small note from Earl, the truck driver who had helped her that night. It read, "You're stronger than you think." Don't ever forget that." Ellie smiled, folding the note carefully and tucking it into her journal. She didn't feel entirely strong yet, but she was getting there, one day at a time.